but I think it's time to start. So the theme of the talk for this evening is called Remembering and Forgetting and Simply Not Hearing. And I remember at a retreat some years ago up at Sang Surya at Byron Bay, a woman who'd be coming to these 7-day retreats for quite a few years was very courageous because she said, you know, this is the first time I have heard the instructions. This is what she said. She was sitting at the back of the room, and the instructions at a retreat happen every day at 9:30 at every retreat we run. And she said, this is the first time I have actually heard the instructions. So we might smile and laugh at that, but this is what happens. It's often very hard to hear something that goes against the stream, goes against the familiar. It's very hard to hear it because mostly we hear what we want to hear. So remembering, forgetting, and not hearing. The 13th century Persian poet Rumi says, the mystery does not get clearer by repeating the question, nor is it bought with going to amazing places. Until you've kept your eyes and your wanting still for 50 years, you don't begin to cross over from confusion. 50 years you just have to take as a random metaphor for a long time. So what confusion is Rumi talking about? It's the confusion that arises from grasping, from clinging, from craving. And why do we need to keep going back and looking at clinging? Because, as I've said, it's so easy to forget the fundamental teaching on suffering that arises from clinging. And forgetting is a universal experience among meditators. So many, and I know in my long years of practice that you need to hear something over and over again. Forgetting the teachings, remembering them, forgetting them. Because when we want something other than what is happening in the moment, it is very easy to go into forgetting because it feels so intensely important to get what we want. And what we forget when we get caught up in that wanting, that intense wanting, we keep forgetting that wanting something other than what is happening leads to an experience on a continuum of dis-ease, unease, distress, mental frenzy, sorrow, woe, to the extremes of torment and anguish. And we all will know, have met those experiences. So the 4 foundations of mindfulness are invitations to remember the moment, remembering just this, without elaboration, without clinging. Breath is the gateless gate to moment by moment awareness. The in-breath has no past, the out-breath has no future. Past and future are fabrications of the thinking mind. Because we give so much authority to the thinking mind, we miss the simplicity of the breath. We miss that gate to the present moment. The in-breath is because the out-breath is. Very simple. It is beyond the push and pull of opposites and dualities that fragment our lives. So when we find ourselves caught in the discomfort or torment of clinging, there is a reminder to remember the moment, to ask oneself, what am I clinging to? And sometimes the answer to that is not immediately obvious. We have to do some investigation. It's not obvious what we are clinging to very often. It may take a bit of time to get to the bottom of it. It may not be that I don't like what he, she, or they said. It may be that I'm clinging to something other than that. I may be clinging to, for example, approval. And approval is a widely desired condition, one pole of opposites of a duality, approval and disapproval. We can notice what happens when we cling to one side of a duality because the apparent absence of the other side of the duality is magnified. And that absence becomes a massive hole for us, a massive gap. And things become very black and white in that moment when we are blind to what we are clinging to. And that gap, that massive gap, also feeds the grasping. And we fail to notice the continuum of opposites because one cannot exist without the other. Approval is because disapproval is. I want this and not that. The gulf becomes immense and the mind becomes frenzied with desire. And you know, when your mind gets into that incredible frenzied, contracted state, everyone will have experienced that. So painful, so much anguish. We all know this intimately. That's why it's so important to remember the moment, to cultivate presence of mind, a mind that can investigate the clinging rather than externalizing the problem onto the situation or another person. And that's what we do to get away from the pain of clinging. We externalize it. And then we create an elaborate narrative of how the other person is wrong and bad and I am the poor victim, or how the situation is wrong and bad and I am the poor victim. And then that becomes another elaborate narrative that we carry around that feeds the clinging. One of the many ways that we can support ourselves to remember the moment is to become familiar with the Four Noble Truths. Now, we hear about them a lot, but a lot of the time we haven't really integrated what they are into our understanding. They're called Noble Truths because they are ennobling, uplifting, enriching, strengthening, inspiring, and liberating. And at the time of the Buddha, nobility became as a result of birth into the higher castes into which one was born in India. And he wanted to turn that oppressive culture around, and he changed it to we are ennobled not by birth but by action. We are ennobled by the action of present moment awareness, of practicing of cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path. So the myth surrounding what happened to Siddhartha Gautama when he awakened under the Bodhi tree and became known as the Buddha gives such authenticity to the humanness of the man. We often don't think of the Buddha as a human being with some, all those statues. We elevate him to some beyond human person. He was a human being. And this story is a very good insight into his humanness. So after he awoke, he reflected on how difficult it would be to convey his insights. And he thought, this is what he says, this generation relies on attachment relishes attachment, delights in attachment. He means clinging in there. It is hard for this generation to see this truth, that is to say, specific conditionality and dependent arising. If I taught the law, others would not understand me, and that would be wearying and troublesome to me. Here's the humanist, so beautiful. People wouldn't understand me, and it would be wearying and troublesome. So in contemporary, if we put this experience into our contemporary terms, this is often the trajectory of any creative process, isn't it? We think of something as have a vision, and then we think this will be too hard to bring into actuality. And so what we need is mentors and supportive people in our lives to help us have the courage to carry out our ideas and visions. And this is what happened in the story. As the Buddha was reflecting, the myth goes that the Brahma Sahampati, who was residing in the God realms, heard the Buddha's reflection, and in the time that it takes for a strong person to flex their arm, he came down and sat beside the Buddha and said to the Buddha, "There are many people with little dust in their eyes who are wasting through not hearing the teachings." And the Buddha listened to the Brahma Sahampati's pleading for him to share the insights and surveyed the world with a compassionate eye, his compassionate and enlightened eye, and decided to go ahead and teach. And since this, his enlightenment occurred in the historical context of the Hindu pantheon, Brahma is the god of creation, along with Shiva and Vishnu. So he had a good mentor then in Brahma Sahampati, the god of creation, because he created a wonderful teaching which has been passed down through the generations. So wasting, what a wonderful description of what it's like to get trapped in the frenzy of grasping, or to live your life caught in the illusion of a separate self. If we want to flourish in this life, we need more remembering than forgetting. So, in order to teach, the Buddha had to distill these incredibly complex teachings into an outline. And you might, as I'm making this contemporary, we might call them learning objectives. Anybody who's written some training courses will know you always have to get them down, is distill it into learning objectives. So he just created this remarkable summary of the teachings, and he called it the Four Noble Truths. And in contemporary terms, it would easily meet corporate standards, and it could be likened to his PowerPoint presentation of learning objectives. So it's very distilled and it's easy to remember. So he decided to try this teaching out on the 5 monks who attended him when he described it as engaged in his struggle. And we know, so he agrees that it is a struggle. And we know what a struggle it is to remember the moment. So the Four Noble Truths are fully know and understand suffering. So know it. We bear witness to each other's suffering, and we bear witness to our own suffering. That is fully knowing suffering, not turning away from it, not denying it. Letting go of craving, which is the origin of suffering. Number 3 is experiencing the cessation of craving. And number 4 is cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path, which is wise view, wise intention, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration, or wise samadhi. They're the Noble Eightfold Path. So when encountering suffering, the medicine is to know and embrace it and understand that it arises from grasping. So instead of following the urge of craving or grasping, the medicine is to let go of it and to see that the craving is in the mind. It is not an object. It is not in the object of craving. We often see the desire as though somehow it resides in the object. So if we go back to the example of craving for approval, we can see that trying to get approval is not a skillful action. The skillful action is to let go of craving for approval, as the craving will end up as an endless dependency on things that are out of our control. Endless dependency. We are free when we let go of that craving, and we can then experience the cessation of craving and the cessation of the self for that moment when it's centered on the desire. So these Four Noble Truths, they are actions, they are prescription for actions. They are not something to believe. They are not dogmas to be believed. They are actions and tasks to be completed. And we forget that. We forget that they are not, because they're called the Four Noble Truths, we think, oh, we just have to believe them. They are actions and tasks to be completed. And the Noble Eightfold Path is a guide for cultivating a way of life that is open, expansive, authentic, joyful, tranquil, rather than small and tight and contracted and stressful. It is a guide to a middle way between grasping and aversion. And that's what the Buddha said. He taught the middle way. And what does that mean? So if you can imagine that you're in a boat going down a river, you're in the middle of the river and you're going down the river, and what you want to do is stay in the middle of the river. And instead of veering into one bank or the other and getting stuck on a bank. So the bank is like a metaphor. One bank is going to be aversion and the other bank is going to be grasping. So we want to just stay when something happens, we want to stay steady in the middle of the river, and we don't want to go to the bank of grasping or to the bank of aversion, because that's where we get stuck and that's where suffering happens. It's a beautiful way, I think, of remembering the middle way, just staying steady with what's happening. And there are many times of the day that we just don't notice when we're in the middle of the river, because we tend to notice things that are that feel bigger and more obvious, because it's a much more subtle experience to notice when there's a level of there's not grasping happening, there's not aversion happening, there's just attention to the moment. There's a pleasant experience of equanimity. And if we start to notice when we're not if we start to notice the absence of grasping and the absence of aversion, we forget to notice that. And that's very much written into the third foundation of mindfulness of mind states, is to notice when there is a mind state present and when it is absent. Aversion is a mind state, grasping is a mind state. They call it, in the third foundation of mindfulness, called desire and hatred. When we're caught in desire, when we're caught in hatred, and then when there's an absence of desire and hatred. That happens many times in a day. And if we notice that, then we will notice when we crash into a bank of and get caught up in a bank of aversion. We also can notice when the aversion fades and we're back in the middle of the river. We're back on balance in the middle of the river. And so we're starting to track that the movement towards aversion and the movement towards grasping, when we start to tracking that really helps us in the remembering of the moment and the remembering of the teachings of letting go of grasping. So that we can notice when the vast and limitless awareness reveals that we are putting the limitations of a small self in the foreground and forgetting the revelatory nature of awareness. So, to finish, just an invitation to you to please let the unconditional friendliness to yourself be your deepest intention. Unconditional friendliness to yourself, because this will support you to walk the middle way with a steady heart and mind. So let's just have a moment of silence, and then we will open it to some questions.